All right, I think we're live.
Hello.
Ani, Indinaway Maganadok, Christine Youngworth, Janganash, Noswin, Mina, Wapshka, Baneshko, Indigenous, Bojuikurang, Nindojaba, Magizi Dodam. So, what I said is hello, all my relatives. You're going to hear that a lot amongst Indigenous people. It's just a way to connect us all. We're all human beings, right? I said my name is Christine Youngworth. I'm known as White Thunderbird Woman. I live in Green Bay, and I'm the Eagle Queen.
My indigenous name is Wasiaya Nishkwandemkwe, Indigenous. So I'm just learning, so bear with me here.
Did we start that one?
Yes, we did start that one.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Penny Knudsen, and I am from Green Bay, Wisconsin.
And your native name means?
Oh, yes, and my native name means doorkeeper, so doorway keeper between heaven and earth.
So we talked a lot last time about how we kind of got into this work and how our nonprofit started. It's not technically a nonprofit. We're in the very beginning works of it. But we kind of wanted to start with how Penny got into Ancestry, which led us to doing this work.
Yeah, so, well, that was a long time ago. It feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? So getting into Ancestry was twofold, I think. So originally, I wanted to, I was filling out an application for Bay Mills to be on the rolls because I wasn't enrolled as a child. So, and that is another story in and of itself. But what happened there was, so I contacted my Aunt Donna, Christine's your mom, and so started to get more information on the family. And part of that application on Bay Mills was asking me, why do you want to be part of the tribe? And I didn't know the answer to that, really. I didn't know why I wanted to be part of Indigenous people, what Bay Mills did or didn't mean to me, because Sault Ste. Marie is my tribe, but the roles weren't open. So I started digging into the lineage, so I got started on Ancestry because it was the easiest platform to use. And then you and I connected, about the boarding schools and stuff. But as I was looking into, so each name on Ancestry, now we've got over 2,600 names on there that are, in our opinion, confirmed. And what that means to us is it's not just, a hint that was provided to us and we're like, oh, hey, yeah, I'm going to put that in there. Like, I quadruple checked these names and made sure that there was some kind of fact that tied them to a later or an earlier ancestor, meaning starting from me to my mother, to my grandmother, to my great-grandmother, and so on. So, and we developed this, I mean, it's taken a couple years, and just to have, 2,600 names, it's like, okay, that's not such a big deal to a lot of people that have like 10,000, 20,000 names inside of Ancestry or whatever genealogical program that they're using. But for us, and for me, it needed to be bound by fact, and to ensure that we were, doing the right research on the right people, because really what it ended up being was I could answer that question then on that application, then it meant something to me. It's like, okay, I want to be part of this people. This people meaning our family, who, what did they go through? How did they live? And to fight to understand our history and who we are as people. So as Indigenous people, not white people, because I always classified myself as white, but as Indigenous people in that culture, I wanted to immerse myself in that culture. So it was really important to find out and to make sure that we had the right names, the right people, the right family. So that's kind of how I got started with that.
Yeah, and I mentioned last time too that I got into looking at the boarding school records because a class I was taking at GB on Indian Ed policy, and that's how we actually got more names added to our tree too. So we got some of those records, which are correspondence from the families talking to the people at the boarding school, or letters back and forth with social workers. And so when we got those records and we're looking at the names, we're like, okay, that person is tied to this person. It says in this record that that was an aunt, or that was a grandma, or another relative. And so we added more people that way. And again, double checked and checked census records and other things to make sure that the people that are tied in our tree are really our ancestors. Because you can go to any of the platforms to do genealogy work, and you get all these names, and they're not necessarily tied to our family, or they're not the correct names, or there's different towns. I mean, there's so many different people with the same names. And so we made sure that the names that are in our records are actual ancestors of ours. So then after we had gone to the Chicago archives and we got those records and we're looking through it, we realized that's only half of our family. So our grandmother is Sault Ste. Marie from the Michigan side, but our grandfather is Sault Ste. Marie from the Canadian side. And so that led us on a search to go to Canada to check their records. So we picked up our Uncle Francis, and we went to Canada. We actually kind of smuggled him in there, right?
Oh, we smuggled them in there all right. We smuggled them in there all right. Well, okay, so we're all in Michigan, right? We got the hotel. I mean, this was a big deal, right? Getting there, getting, Christine, myself, my Aunt Donna, Chris, the driver, and Uncle Francis. And it's like, okay, so now we have everybody here. Now we have to go to Canada. And then we learned that Uncle Francis didn't have a passport.
Yep.
It's like, well.
But he has a status card stating that he is the Garden River Band, because so I mentioned my grandmother's Sault Ste. Marie, so he's from my grandfather's side, right? My grandpa and him are brothers. So he does have paperwork saying that he is a descendant of the Garden River Band. And so we're like, okay, well, that should be enough, right? We should be able to get in. We all had passports, right?
Oh,
so
yeah. We're gonna wing it is what we did. So we're driving, and Chris is driving, and he says, well, what do I do? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, what do I do if they ask, like for Uncle Francis's passport? I was like, I don't know. We'll just provide these papers. We're gonna feel it out, right? So it was I was unnerved, to say the least. I think I stopped breathing while we were in there. So it was like, or while we were in the drive, through. So Chris, we give him the 4 of the supposed to be 5 passports. And so he hands them to the guy, and the guy's looking at it, right?
And he looks in the car.
Yeah.
So we're like, he counted everybody, right?
And then he's like, what are you in here for? Or what do you come visiting Canada for? So we said, just research, And he's like, hands us the passports back, and he goes, okay, have a great day.
And didn't ask for any documentation for Uncle Francis. We're like, okay, let's go. And then after we left, we're like, they document, right, the names of the people that are coming in. So when we leave, like, I'm going to have an issue getting back in.
Yeah.
And
how did we say that we started with 4 and now we have 5? Did we're trying to smuggle them back into the United States? I don't know.
They were all joking, like, oh, we'll just like hide them in the back seat and have them get, get a little bit tinted windows, just it'll be fine, right? So
right. Oh.
Anyway, and it ended up being just fine. We went back, and when we left this time, we gave him the 4 passports and then just his driver's license, and he didn't ask for any other documentation. He's just like, all right, thank you. Hope you had a fun trip. And that was it. We're like, whew.
Right.
Thank goodness, right? But
so we smuggled him in.
We did.
We did.
Yeah. In and back out, right?
Right.
So what was really cool, though, is we went to Algoma University, and they are a non-Indigenous college, but you walk in, and even like the doorways had the entrance names like East, West, North, and South in Anishinaabe language, which is really cool for a non-Indigenous college. And I think they said they have maybe 20% are Indigenous people. And you just walk in, and there's like artwork on the walls, and there's like a whole wall of like the Indian boarding school experience. Like, you just walk in and you're just like, wow, this is so cool that this college is so dedicated to sharing that part of history that is often not told in this country anyway. Right.
It's got pillars on the inside too. So it's not like you're just seeing, Indigenous from the outside. You're seeing it like everywhere you turn. It was like in your face. You turn this way and you see the history along the walls and the rivers that they walked in and
Yeah.
fished in. It was just like almost like a 3D perspective almost of the life. It was so real. So hats off to this school
Yes, for
for
sure.
what they did.
And we walked in and we didn't have an appointment. We're just like, we're not going to give people a heads up because we didn't know after our experience in Gaylord Diocese where they didn't really give us anything. We went to Algoma thinking, we're just going to walk in, not have an appointment. And
Doesn't it seem surreal that we got to like put up a fight?
yeah,
It's like putting up a fight, and we come in with guns blazing, if
Right.
you will, like this huge defense
Yeah.
that we mask
It
all the
is.
time.
So we walk in and we see this lady walking into an office and we're like, oh, excuse me. We heard there's archives here and our family was in Indian boarding schools. And she's like, oh, we're walking into a meeting right now. Can you guys come back? And we're like, oh, we're from, Michigan. We're from the US. We're not, this is our only day here. And she's like, you know what? I don't have to go to that meeting. And she totally just, and they're like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, we don't need you. Go ahead and help them. And she did. We must
Yeah.
have been there for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And she was just like in it with us. And she starts pulling photo albums and records and everything from the boarding school. But they only had so many boarding schools. And just like the US has over 400 boarding schools, Canada is very similar in that. And so she shared records and some family names with us. We haven't gone through all of it, but so far we haven't found names of our family in those records. But it was cool to see how they had pictures like from 1920s, I think, and current. And when we had gone to Gaylord and Holy Childhood to try to find records, they're like, oh, it wasn't common to take pictures, which is a lie because even at Carlisle, they have pictures, and that was one of the very first boarding schools in the late 1830s. So if they had pictures then, we know they have pictures, and I don't understand why they're hiding anyway.
Right.
We did get some leads, and we're still searching for the Canadian side of our family in terms of like we don't have our great grandmother's birth record. There's a lot behind how even our grandpa got into the U.S. because we found out from our Uncle Francis that what was the name of the town in Michigan that was giving birth certificates? Something with an R. Not Rapid City, something city.
I can't remember now.
I can't think of the name of it. But anyway, they could come into the U.S. and this doctor, if you gave him $1, would give you a U.S. birth certificate. So our grandpa, my Uncle Francis's dad, actually fought in the Canadian War and then came to the U.S. and got that birth certificate and then was able to, was it Rogers City?
Yes, Rogers City.
Was then able to fight for the U.S. war. So, and names were changed because of that too. And I think that's part of our problem finding our ancestors is when they did come in from Canada, a lot of times their names were changed. And so trying to go back and find their records in Canada and all of that has been a struggle. We're going to keep going after, right? But
yeah, because there really weren't surnames, if you will. And when asked, they didn't know what to say. I mean, really. So a lot of times it was what it sounded like, is what names they were given, which is
or
just
when they
a
went to the
shame.
boarding school too, then they
Yeah.
were given those surnames and different names and things like that too. So
Right.
yeah, it's very confusing. I forgot to back up though. So before we went to Algoma, in Canada, we had gone to the Gaylord Diocese, and they were like, well, we don't know if we can really share those records because we don't have documentation that that person actually passed or that you're an ancestor. And I'm like, listen, Carlisle has all their records public. Anybody has access to them. I don't understand why you're not able to do that for us. And we're not really sure why there's those walls up and why they're saying they didn't have anything. But because we brought Uncle Francis, they said, well, we'll go get his file. So we're thinking we're going to get all this information from him. And they came out with one report card
Right.
from the years he was there. And Uncle Francis is like, I
family
don't even
member.
remember school, right?
Yeah, I think they had some family members, his sister.
Yeah, yep.
They had those, but they're like, so you can look at them, but you can't take them with.
Yeah.
It's,
Or take a picture or anything, just look at it.
yeah. So
And it was just a report card. That was it. Chicago Archives had all of it. It had the family letters that they were writing back and forth from the school and the social workers. And here is the diocese, which is supposed to have all the records, and they're not giving us anything. I don't know. I mean, we've heard there was fires in certain places and records were lost. We don't really know.
yeah. But we know they have them because we even got those postcards.
Yep.
So I'm going to grab those postcards. So these postcards were given to us from
Holy Childhood.
Holy Childhood.
So that's the school where, in Harbor Springs, where both our grandfather's side and grandmother's side had gone to boarding school. And we took Uncle Francis there, and he actually agreed to do an interview, which we don't have the finished version of that yet. But he did give us some pictures of that time.
So if you can see, here's 1951. These are posed pictures, but they're on postcards. So we know that there are, and this kind of makes me mad, but not necessarily understanding the story behind it, but letting these, or having, the indigenous people dress as Indians is just, this is sad, really.
And even this picture, he's like, look, they get to go on field trips, and I love how these pictures aren't posed. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, that is 100% posed, because even Uncle Francis and my grandma had shared stories about how they didn't always have food, and they would sneak into the nuns' quarters and steal their food and stuff. And here it's like, oh, they have a whole bushel of apples that they can just freely eat. And look at that creepy guy in the background. You see that? Ew, it just looks, he just gives me the creeps just looking at this picture.
Yeah. And here's the school itself, and this school is down now. So they tore this school down, but it's just an ugly school. And here are some, so minus what they're eating, you can kind of get an idea of, how they had to eat for lunch, all together like that. The girls were separated by the boys, and then their sleeping quarters, it's just very institutional, the way they had to live. So it's pretty sad. So just even on these postcards, we know that they have pictures. They have a lot to share, but they're just not sharing, really.
Yep.
He even told us in the interview with Uncle Francis that they have glass microfilm,
Yep.
Where
there are pictures. They're just not developed. So,
Yeah.
But they didn't tell us that when we first came, right? They're like, oh no, it wasn't common to take pictures there, but they have all the stuff on microfilm. And it's like, how can we work with them to try to get those, right? Because we know we have family that attended that they had their picture taken. They all had their picture taken while they were there. And how much of the stories aren't being shared and what's hidden in those pictures, it's like.
Yeah. So I think that, just to kind of give them a history too. So for those of you that weren't part of the first live stream that we had, the boarding schools and how they were established, the Indian boarding schools, they were established by the United States, or essentially governed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or somehow, I'm still learning how that was all put together, but each county in each city, in each state, had social workers that looked for these children and pretty much told the parents, we need to take your children, we need to school them, they need school, and if they're not in school, there's going to be some consequences, really.
Some were thrown in jail, or we going through the archive records, some families were like, if you don't send your kid, like, we're coming to pick up you, and you're going to go to jail for not sending your kid to school.
Right.
And policies aren't much different today, right? There's strict attendance records, and if parents have truancy issues or they're missing a lot of school, you can be fined for it, right? So policies haven't changed much. I don't think people realize that.
Right. So the schools really were established. We can look back on it now as part of history, and I think that's really what Christine and I are really focused on, is unleashing that information and telling people, really what happened in those schools and why they were established. They were really established to say, there are no more Indian children. We're not going to have any more Indians anymore, and we're going to assimilate. We're going to take out the culture, the Indian culture, the indigenous culture, and we're going to make these Indian children white.
Yeah. Their slogan was "Kill the Indians to save the man," basically. So if you can wipe all of their culture and all of who they are, when they go home, they're just going to assimilate to white cultures because that's all they're going to know. So it was a way to assimilate and try to wipe out indigenous cultures.
Yeah. So part of ancestry, as we're going through ancestry and we're finding, our ancestors, we're really focused on where they were, how they lived. Because, as I said in the very beginning, as I was giving you my indigenous name, I'm just learning and I'm so disappointed. I'm so disappointed in history, and it saddens me to the core that I don't know a whole lot of our culture. It's really sad. It breaks my heart that I don't know how to celebrate, and that I don't know how to do Thanksgiving or Christmas or the other holidays as part of our people, and how we grew up. And so seeing the traditional healer and doing that was just very welcoming, very homecoming, for me. So I think that to the core, really, that's really what we're trying to do. We're really trying to, figure out, what happened and let other people know. And I was part of the Holy Childhood interview, and it was very maddening. Honestly, it was very maddening for many different reasons. And I really appreciate Christine being with me because she can kind of hold me in check too. I think we do that for each other, making sure that we don't let our emotions dictate, how we're going to move forward with it, but at the same time, let our emotions dictate how we're going to move forward with it.
Yeah. So when we had gone to Holy Childhood earlier, there was a guy doing archive work, and he asked Uncle Francis, like, I'm starting to do interviews of people who were in the Indian boarding schools. I have no hidden agenda. I just really want to hear your story, the good, the bad. We really want to get those stories told. And so part of me feels guilty, like I should have known, even though he's saying he doesn't have this agenda, like it's the church doing it. And I'm not saying anything bad about religions, right? I'm just saying they don't come from the same understanding of what indigenous people have historically gone through, because that part of history is just not told. And so unless you've devoted your entire life to understanding those cultures, you don't really have that understanding how to best support them, right? And so we went into this interview, and Uncle Francis was like, yeah, I'll tell him, whatever. And he did. But it was very like just factual, like, what was your day-to-day life like? And there was one part Uncle Francis got really emotional, and we're all sitting back, like, lean into that, like, help him through that. And it was just, he changed the subject real quickly and then didn't talk about it anymore. And so we know there were still things he just didn't feel comfortable sharing. It wasn't the right space to be able to share. And so when the interview was done, I told the guy, because the last thing he said to Uncle Francis is, yeah, I know you went through some horrible things there, but can you think of one good thing that the school did for you? And he's like, no, not one. And I'm so glad he stuck to his guns on that, because to me, that was his hidden agenda, right? That all these bad things had happened, but some had good experiences, and maybe some did, but the good experiences still didn't account for the fact that these kids didn't give love, they didn't give nurturing, they weren't told that they were gifted, that they have a reason for being on this earth, and they have this culture, and this, all of that was taken away from them. How do you expect these kids to grow up and be good parents when they weren't parented, because they were in these institutions where they weren't given that love and attention and affection? And he didn't ask any questions like, how did that affect your ability to connect with your culture and have your kids and everyone else connected to the culture? He didn't talk about any of that. So we left just feeling really just heavy about everything, and like we failed him, our uncle, that he wasn't given the right experience to be able to release the trauma and stories that he's been hanging on to his whole life. And so then I found out the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition was going around the U.S. and interviewing. And I'm just like, that's all Indigenous people who have the background and the schooling and everything to best do these interviews and support the people who went through the schools and their families who were there to support them as well. So we found out they're going to Harbor Springs, and that's where we just were. And so my mom and I took Uncle Francis there, And it was just a whole different feeling. You walk in and it's just like, oh, you're surrounded by Indigenous people, and you just feel that love and support as you're walking in there. From the person who did the photography to the person who did the intake to the one doing the interview, and even the counselor after, were all Indigenous people. They know the history, they know the culture, they know how to best support you. And it was just a totally different experience. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't, they leaned into, they let Uncle Francis tell the story he wanted to tell. It wasn't like, yes, we have these script of questions we can ask, but in the end, Uncle Francis is like, bottom line, this is what I want. And what he ended up, I'm not going to say the whole story. Eventually we're going to share the videos when it's time, but what he wanted to get out is, yes, he went through some horrific things in the school, but somebody, a child that, another student that he was with, that they were in the basement together, had died, and he was carried away. He didn't go home. We know from the stories that we've heard in Canada that there's mass graves and unmarked graves of students who died in those schools, and they weren't brought home. They weren't given that proper burial. And Canada and their tribes have been searching grounds of former schools and finding those students that weren't given the proper burial and sending them home so they can get that. And that's what Uncle Francis's message was my friend died there. Find him, bring him home, let him have that proper burial that he wasn't given.
Just to add on to that too, I didn't go this time around because I had to work, but Christine gave me the recording, and it's very raw and definitely not ready for anyone yet. But as I was listening to it, I closed my eyes and I cried because I felt so much for him. But the most important thing that I think I felt from him was anger, where I didn't feel that in the first interview. I felt such a resounding sense of, why did you do this to me? And this is what you took from me. It was so incredibly sad to hear that from him. And there was an abruptness about his replies, and he, to me, felt extremely angry. And I cried for a lot of different reasons. Most importantly, because he was able to unleash it, to just really get it out. And it's incredibly sad, really.
And I think for us having grandkids, right? You listen to these stories and you think that we can't even imagine if that happened to our grandkids and how they would be treated in that manner. And it's hard, and these stories and this work is hard, but we have to do it. We have to hear all the stories, because if they're able to share that story finally after all these years, we have to hear it. We have to know what happened so that we can ensure this is never going to happen to our kids. And history has a way of repeating itself. We know that. We have to share these stories. We have to know this truth. We have to make sure our kids going to school today are treated in a good way. There's still those hidden biases that people, some of it is they weren't taught this history in school, right? We didn't learn this in school. And the things that we did learn was like, Indians are savage. And so I don't think any of my friends knew that I was Native in school.
No.
I mean, we were even going to school when the whole treaty thing was going down, and how Act 31 came to be, which is the Wisconsin mandate to teach about Indigenous history and cultures. And it was around the fishing docks where they were spearfishing and Indigenous people were being attacked. And I mean, it's still happening today. Just, I don't know, it was 2019, 2020, a good friend of mine was out spearfishing with their friend, and they were shot at. And just for spearfishing, just for doing the traditional things that they've always been able to do. And there's this misunderstanding in the world that they have these special rights, and they're not special rights. They're things that we've always been able to do. And we're guaranteed to always be able to continue our ways, and however that meant to us, hunting and fishing and all of that. And there's just an ignorance and misunderstanding about that because it wasn't taught in the schools, even though, so Act 31 came in 1989, and schools had to teach about that. But when we were going to school, they weren't teaching anything about that. They were telling old history. And
yeah, well, that act came out in 89. I mean, I graduated in 93. You graduated in 1992. Yep. So this is just years after, just a few years after, and we didn't know about it. But
yeah, so I think that's what's really fueling the work that we're doing. We know this history wasn't told, and I mean for us too. I think growing up, we went to some powwows. We knew that we were Native, right? But we didn't have any of the culture. We didn't know any of the language. We didn't go to ceremonies. We didn't do any of that stuff because my grandma raised her kids in Green Bay, so she wasn't anywhere near the reservation, and we don't know how that came to be. If it was for work, I mean, there's the Indian relocation. There's all these things that happen to our people, and maybe they came to this area because there was better work here than was back in the reservations during that time. But we lost all that language and culture. But also, maybe grandma and grandpa, because they were both in the boarding schools, maybe they didn't want a chance being anywhere around there where their kids could be taken away and going through, because mom's generation did go to boarding school. Our generation did go to boarding school. Boarding schools in the US closed in 1988. That wasn't so long ago, 1988, 1996 in Canada. People think these stories are like way in the past, right? But they're affecting us still today. There's this thing called intergenerational trauma, and I won't go in all of it, but I just want to give one example. So there was a study done on mice where one generation was exposed to the scent of orange, a strong scent of orange, and then given an electrical shock. 3 to 4 generations later, the mice, even though they weren't the ones that directly were exposed to that scent of orange and then shocked, were showing a fear and run away from that scent. So think about how that trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Things that we're experiencing today, anxiety, depression, all of those things, even though it's not something we directly went through, our ancestors did, and we feel that to this day. Our goal is to heal that, to help families understand why there's such a disconnect, why there's so much dysfunction going on. If we can heal this generation and we can help our grandkids, there's hope for the future. And that's what we're all about trying to do, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Whew, that was a lot today. Not to change subjects, but I do kind of want to change subjects a little bit here. I know we showed our business card last time. We're still developing it and fine tuning it and everything else, but and you can see it on our Ganawenjikewikweg Facebook page, the outline of it. And how that came to be is we worked with an elder to get the name. We got the name. We wanted it to reflect Indigenous women, keeping our history and culture alive. And so that's how that name came to be. But Penny and her husband, Chris, were looking at images because, I mean, we want to make sure that we're not copying somebody else's work and what they're doing and everything, and have it be kind of our own image. So you found these amazing silhouettes on, what was the software you were using?
What software were you using, Chris? Photoshop.
Yeah, of these silhouettes of 2 Native women. I'm like, oh, that's perfect.
Right.
And how the turtle came to be is, I didn't even know I was having this dream, but I went and seen our healer, and he was doing this thing, and he's like, so tell me about this dream that you're having about a turtle. I'm like, I'm not having any, I couldn't think of any dreams I was having about a turtle. He's like, are you sure? And I sat and thought for a minute, and I'm like, oh yeah, I am having a dream about a turtle. I completely forgot about it. But in my dream, it was like this mother turtle is walking alongside of me, not saying anything. We're just walking in silence, and she's looking up at me and smiling, and we just walked along. But the dream I had after that was a baby turtle walking alongside of me, looking up at me and smiling. And he's like, oh, okay. And that's it. He didn't tell me, like, what does that mean, right? So we're still up in the Sioux, and we visited our cousin Dale. Hopefully he's watching this, or he watches later on. And we're telling him how I seen this healer, and that's what he said. And he's like, oh, he's like, that's good medicine right there. And he's like, you know, the turtle isn't just representative of Turtle Island, but in helping you find your path in life. He's like, you're finding your path in life. I was like, oh my gosh. And I swear, ever since that happened last summer, turtles are everywhere around me. I was working with this amazing elder, Alex, and I was telling him the story, and he's like, oh, I've been meaning to give you something. And I'm like, what is it? And he goes outside and he gives me this wooden hand-carved turtle statue. I'm like, no way. And then my son, for my birthday, not even realize this until like a month ago, it didn't click for me, right? He gives me this bracelet, and you can track a sea turtle. And at my birthday, that was back in May, I was like, oh, that's so cute. Like, oh, and then I was thinking about, oh my God, there's another turtle. And so now we're telling the story to my Uncle Francis, and he's like, oh, I've been meaning to give you something. I'm like, come on, another turtle. And I'm like, okay, this turtle has to be on our design.
Yeah.
And they're intentionally facing east because when Europeans came, we were pushed west. And so I wanted them facing east because we're gaining back what was taken from us. So that was very intentional. And the color red, for me, it's like, I thought of like missing murdered Indigenous women in that red handprint, and how women, the violence and everything against Indigenous women, right, was so like, it just came to mind as we're trying to think of this design, that color red. And I wanted, because we're two women doing this, and I'm like, yeah, we have to have that color red involved in there too. So that's kind of how that design came.
Yeah. So I didn't tell you this though either, and I just thought about it. Our neighbor this summer, just a few months ago, sent us a video of a turtle in our plant in the side of our house, and said, hey, you have a visitor. So, and it traveled, you could see its path all the way across, and I'll show you after, but it was all the way across our yard. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's another turtle.
Wow.
So that's crazy.
Heading east, right? Oh my gosh.
It's crazy.
That's nuts. So we always try to tell a funny story. And so I want to end with that. So when we were driving home after Uncle Francis's interview, Mom and I are in the car, and Penny's heard the story before too. But I'm like, Uncle Francis, I'm trying to think of a funny story to share in our next live. Can I share the story of your first kiss? And he's like, okay, I guess, right? So here's the story. So now Uncle Francis's brother is married to my grandmother, okay? And Grandma's sister is Aunt Lil. So when I'm telling the story and I mention Aunt Lil, Uncle Francis, okay, kind of how they're related here, right? So Grandma and Uncle Francis's brother, they're in the front seat, they're, driving away, and Uncle Francis and Aunt Lil are sitting in the back seat. And Uncle Francis, I asked him, I'm like, well, how old do you think you were? He's like, I don't know, maybe around 15 years old. Never kissed anyone or anything like that. And he's like, and I don't know what came over your Aunt Lil, but all of a sudden she was all up in my business, and she's laying this heavy, heavy kiss on me. And all of a sudden, your grandmother reaches across and like, what are you doing? And grabs her by the back of the hair and yanks her away from him. And he was like, dang, she's like, she was kissing me with some big intentions, and the way your grandmother ripped her head away, I didn't even have time to have any of that intention back for her. She just like ruined that moment. So we're telling the story, and we're driving the car. I'm like, so I can tell this, right? And as we're talking about this, here's the song that comes in the background. I kid you not. That's what's playing in the background. And we started laughing so hard. I'm like, okay, that's the story we have to share then, because here's the song coming on the radio. And we had, oh my God, we laugh so much. You have to, right? Oh, yeah. It's like life is too short.
Right. And then a nice shout out to Uncle Francis too. He just turned 92.
Yay.
So
91.
91
on Tuesday was his birthday. Yeah. So yes, isn't that amazing?
That's
wow.
Very cool.
So we also want to end our lives sharing something kind of inspirational. So I came across this quote here. It says, we're running out of emotional capacity because we're trying to do things individually that were meant to be done collectively. And that really resonated with me because it takes us back to Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And that's that village mentality. It takes a village to raise a child, right? We've all heard this. But that same village needs to support us and nurture us all through life. And I think in this colonized world we live in, it seems like when kids are 18, they're off on their own and go figure it out. And there's so much like anxiety and depression tied around that, because kids are growing up feeling, once I'm 18, now I have to figure it out. I can't go home and seem like a disappointment because I didn't figure it out on my own, right? Mm-hmm. We need that same nurturing all through life. Even now, like we look to our Uncle Francis, we look to each other for support. That's so needed in this world.
Yeah.
And so just reflect on that quote today. I'm going to show it one more time before we close here. We're running out of emotional capacity because we're trying to do things individually that were meant to be done collectively. Reach out to your village. And I think that's it for today.
Yeah. Miigwech.
Miigwech.